So hey guys, today we're talking about another niche topic. Today we're talking about mandatory effects. And recently we haven't really been getting any new cards with mandatory effects, but honestly mandatory effects are kind of broken in certain circumstances. So if we go over a basic uh, chain order, right? Because this is already kind of jank with triggers in some cases. So let's say we have, let's say, an Appaloosa on our field. And then we have, let's say, I don't know, something like on trigger, like Swordsoul Jichao. Or actually, Jichao is not the best example for this. We have something a little bit better. Let's say we have Appaloosa, then let's use, like, I don't know, it could be like Centurion Legatia. So let's assume I special summon a Centurion Legatia, but I have an Appaloosa. And we're going to assume I quick tinker this and my opponent is doing something at the same time. So let's say in this case, they are special summoning, well, it can't be Chi because of how that works. So let's say we granted fusion for Albion, okay? So in this case, if I were to go Legatia affected draw, then I cannot Appaloosa Albion. And this is just how it will always kind of work. And if I have multiple quick effects, there are also the idea of certain quick effects that respond to certain other quick effects. So in this case, we have like, let's assume maybe we have, instead of Baron de Floor, let's use a different negate, like Infinite Impermanence isn't actually a good example. So let's say we have, I don't know, it gets a bit complicated. But we just need a regular kind of monster negate, which I can't think of off the top of my head right now. I can only think of counter traps that do this at the moment. There are a few cards that work like this, but not like Imperm, right? Kind of like regular speed, negate, for monsters only. Like, I guess, something akin to like a trap hole. But either way, idea is that trigger effects happen and then quick effects happen. So if you have multiple quick effects or certain triggers, depending on the order, right? We also even have the idea of, let's say Albion is chain 1 here, and then Legatia would be chain 2 if you were to activate this. If Legatia were actually a mandatory effect, interestingly enough, it would always be occurring before Albion happens, allowing you to always activate Appaloosa to negate Albion here. But if we were, of course, to go Albion 1 and then you were to go Legatia 2, this would chain block your own Appaloosa, not allowing you to negate that Albion, meaning to actually negate this Albion, you would need to give up the Legatia effect. And that's part of the reason why, like, priority kind of matters. Like, there's, like, some level of player priority when it comes to resolving chain links. And there are various effects on this, like, notably, we have the Synchro 12 that I can't remember the name of right now. We'll figure it out. Synchro 12, there aren't that many of them. This one, Despian Lulu Walula. This becomes like a completely terrible card, depending on, or like an okay card, depending on several factors. But the big thing, of course, is that I don't remember on which player's turn it was. I believe it was like on your own turn, because of like how kind of chains work. Your negate just doesn't work against trigger effects at all, because this is actually a trigger negate and not a quick effect. You can't really control the chain order properly. So there are points in time where your negate would be on a lower chain link, where you would want it to be on a higher chain link, which prevents you from negating with this negate altogether, which is kind of jank and kind of funny in its own sort of way. Making something like Ryziel's Cross's negate like pretty broken, being able to negate from any chain link and being completely impossible to chain block, and being completely gross. And in fact, there isn't a monster negate like Cross, which is kind of brutal. I mean, there's one that's a little bit close with Pegasus Twin Saber, which has the restriction in comparison to Cross, where you're only able to negate specifically a monster effect that was activated on your opponent's field, whereas Cross is any monster effect, period, in a chain link, right? Which makes it a lot stronger. So, for example, Harpour in the graveyard, I would not be able to negate with Twin Saber. A card activating in the hand, like Mar Chair, I guess. I would not be able to negate that with Twin Saber either, but of course, all of those would be negatable via Cross. Even if they were triggers being chain link blocked or whatever, still could negate it. But yeah. If we were to have a mandatory effect, so if, well, it wouldn't be necessarily that great if this were a mandatory, but if Lulu with Lilith instead was a mandatory effect to kind of negate, right? Or something like that, then you would never miss the timing on this, because this would always be, well, no wait, since you want this to be on a higher chain link, this would actually always be a completely useless card if it were mandatory, meaning you could never negate any triggers, making it completely garbage, actually, in the case of this specific card. But there are specific cards that would benefit from this being able to be chain link blocked by your opponent's effects. So whenever your opponent would trigger something, so like whenever they would activate an effect, like let's say we have the idea of Random Fusion, we have like well, actually with Draco Tail, if we went with Draco Tail as our example here, depending on whose turn it is, this will resolve differently, right? You're going to find mana, and then you're going to attempt to resolve like your Draco Tail card. So we have like Malulu, we have Pan, Urgula. So all of these guys are triggers, and this is a little bit annoying. Arthalion would technically also be a trigger, as well as Gulamel. But the thing about like Malulu is that, well, Malulu has a negate tied to it that's non-targeting, which is pretty strong, right? But if we had a mandatory effect activating on the field, then Malulu would never, literally never be able to negate it, because it would always be on the higher chain link, I believe, right? Or no, it would be on the, if this were on the lower chain link, it can never negate a higher chain link. This is confusing. But there are effects that would never be negatable. This is a bad example because this is a targeted negate, which is confusing. But if we were to have a non-targeted negate like Apollosa or Baron, it would never be able to negate those mandatory effects when you cover them with like a trigger. Specifically, one of your opponent's triggers is beneficial for this. It's like extremely niche and kind of hard to like set up fully. But yeah, there are times where it'd be like, if you do IP here and then SP, if you activate SP effect, you can't negate. But even if you do not do SP effect, I could cover it with my own trigger, making it not negatable. In certain times, there are times where you would want to activate an effect just for the sake of activating an effect, and that could be beneficial in a number of ways. But you could also get punished heavy, I guess, like with Kashira Riseheart being like a magnet for every triple tactics card. Like all of your Crash guys being triggers is fine in the case where you're playing around triple tactics where you don't want to activate your Kashira effects. Riseheart mandatory effect to attach a card that would just consistently trigger and go off and easily allow your opponent to force you to play into like a triple tactics talents, which is a little bit interesting. But yeah, there really is a lot going on here, I guess. But mandatory effects, I suppose, mostly don't help when they're your own effects, because if you have two trigger effects, you can kind of change the order. But forcing your effects consistently to be on the lower chain link is a little bit interesting, but if your opponent also has access to mandatory effects, then it'll be like always kind of the same order depending on how many mandatory effects we activate. So it's like mandatory effect, my mandatory effect, my opponent's mandatory effect. So that would be if I was turn player, I guess. it goes like technically if I have three mandatory effects, they would activate all three, and then my opponent would activate their one. Or it would be the reverse. My opponent activates their one or two. I activate my three. I believe for mandatory effects, that's how it works. So depending on who's turn player, that would still matter. But since we don't have any, well, not really any mandatory effects being used at the moment, that's just some like space, I guess, for design. Well, card design, I guess. And having to play around your own mandatory effects, I think, is also a little bit interesting. It's not exactly always in like a useful context. Sometimes it like of course mandatory effects activate when you don't want them to because they are mandatory effects. That is something for your opponent to try to play into to kind of force you to use certain mandatory effects, and then for you to play around, making the game a little bit more interesting. But of course, like that does add to the game's overall complexity. So it's harder for new players to get into, and that's always just a problem, I guess. Can't think of a super good example at the moment where you would be triggering multiple mandatory effects and certain chain resolutions. It would all come down to matchups. So with specifically the Draco Tail cards, though, you would always be losing into them with mandatory effects with like your with Malulu and such. Actually, I believe, right? If they're on the lower chain link, then they're not able to negate. If they're on the higher, they're able to negate. It's weird to think about sometimes. So, some negates work and stuff work the opposite. It's just how it works sometimes. My brain's like just fried today, I guess. But yeah, hopefully that kind of gets the point across. And yeah, that's all I have for you guys today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.